He was diving to the bottom of the ocean when he stumbled upon a strange, airtight container. What he saw inside made him turn pale. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a low swell that rolled slowly toward the Florida coast. The horizon was clean again, the kind of endless blue that could lull even the most experienced seaman into forgetting how unforgiving the water could be. On the deck of the Atlantic Surveyor, the air smelled of salt, rust, and diesel fumes, and a thin layer of mist clung to the railings as the morning sun began to lift. For most of the crew, it was just another day at sea. For Derek Miller, it was supposed to be another routine dive, another box to check on a list of underwater inspections that had long lost their thrill. Derek was a man who rarely spoke more than necessary, but his presence on the ship had weight. Years of diving had left his skin marked by the sun and salt, his hands coarse and scarred from constant contact with metal and rope. He moved deliberately, with the easy confidence of someone who had lived more hours underwater than most men spent driving cars. That morning, he went through the familiar ritual of preparation, checking his air mix, cleaning the seal on his mask, inspecting his dive knife, adjusting the straps of his fins, and verifying the readings on his depth gauge and pressure monitor. Around him, the rest of the crew were preparing the winches and tether lines. The assignment was simple enough. The company had been contracted by a communications consortium to inspect a section of undersea cable after last week's tropical storm. It was a stretch of seabed Derek knew well. Flat, silty, predictable. There was no reason to expect surprises, but experience had taught him that the ocean didn't care about reason. The ocean always kept something hidden. He stood by the rail, watching the sunlight flicker over the surface, and for a moment he let the steady rhythm of the waves fill the silence in his head. The sound of the compressor kicked on behind him, sharp and mechanical, breaking the calm. The dive supervisor gave him a nod. "You're good to go, Miller." Derek returned the nod and lowered himself into the water without a word. The first few feet were the same as always, the faint resistance of the surface giving way to cool, endless silence. Visibility was better than he'd expected. The storm had churned the upper layers, but down here the world was still and calm. The beam from his headlamp sliced through a field of suspended particles, revealing the faint shimmer of the cable line beneath him. He followed it carefully, hand over hand, inspecting for visible damage, taking short bursts of photographs with the mounted camera. A small crack in the insulation, minor abrasions, nothing unusual. He was almost ready to ascend when something caught his eye off to the right. At first, it was just a shape, a faint reflection of light that didn't fit the texture of the sand. He drifted closer, frowning behind his mask. The surface was smooth, unnaturally straight, a corner of something metallic half buried under silt and sea growth. The dimensions were too precise to be rock. It was man-made. He hovered for a moment, measuring the edges in his mind. It looked like the corner of a large box, maybe a shipping container, though there was no sign of the usual corrugation or painted markings. Curiosity overrode protocol. He turned on his wrist camera and began recording as he cleared the sediment with gentle sweeps of his gloved hand. The metal was pale and cold to the touch, slick but strangely unpitted. He expected to see corrosion, barnacles, or some kind of marine life clinging to the surface, but there was almost nothing. Just smooth, unblemished metal, as though the object had only recently been placed there. Derek leaned in closer. Along the edge, where the sand met steel, he could see the faint trace of a welded seam. The craftsmanship was deliberate, too deliberate for standard shipping equipment. He checked his depth gauge, just under 100 meters. The object shouldn't have been here. The nearest cargo routes ran far offshore, and no records of recent wrecks had crossed their briefings. For a moment, the water felt heavier around him, pressing closer. He marked the coordinates on his digital pad, took several stills, and studied the surroundings. The seabed was otherwise featureless, a monotonous plain of sand and broken shells. This object sat in eerie isolation, like it had been dropped from the sky. He stayed a few minutes longer, examining the corners and searching for serial numbers, but there were none. The surface was completely unmarked. No paint, no etched letters, nothing that could identify its origin. He tried to pry a small section of sediment near the base to look for a foundation, but the steel continued straight downward. It was embedded deep. Something about it unsettled him, though he couldn't explain why. He'd seen plenty of wreckage in his career, old hulls, fallen cranes, even plane fragments, but this was different. This felt intentional. He took one last photograph, then began his slow ascent. As he rose, the shape of the object receded into the murky blue until it was just a darker shadow against the sand. He kept his breathing steady, pausing at his decompression stop, watching the bubbles spiral upward past his visor. The ocean above shimmered with sunlight, but the thought of that silent metal box sitting on the seafloor lingered in his mind. When he broke the surface, the team was already leaning over the rail, waiting for the thumbs-up signal. Derek raised a hand, then climbed the ladder, his gear dripping onto the deck. The air felt hot after the chill of the deep. Someone handed him a towel. Another man took his tanks. "Find anything?" the supervisor asked casually. Derek hesitated before answering. "Something. Not part of the line." They crowded around the monitor as he uploaded the camera feed. The image flickered on the screen. Grainy, pale blue light, then the gleaming corner of the object. A murmur went through the group. One of the younger technicians whistled softly. "What the hell is that thing?" Nobody had an answer. The supervisor leaned closer, adjusting the zoom. "Could be a container," he said finally, "but it's not standard issue. Look at those seams." Derek dried his hands and watched the replay again. Silent. The light glinted off the metal just enough to show the texture. No corrosion, no barnacle clusters, as if it had been sealed against the water entirely. The more he looked, the less it resembled anything he'd seen on a ship. He uploaded the coordinates, labeled the file, and filled out his report, all by the book. But something in the back of his mind refused to let it go. Later, as the ship idled on the calm water and the sun drifted toward afternoon, Derek sat near the stern, reviewing the footage again on his tablet. The waves slapped against the hull in slow, rhythmic intervals, like the ticking of a clock. He zoomed in on one still frame, examining the faint weld lines. They weren't crude. Whoever built that container had intended it to survive pressure and time. He thought about the silence of the seafloor, how unnatural the thing had looked resting there. By the time the shift ended, he had written a full note to the supervisor recommending a retrieval operation. The object's placement and condition were too unusual to ignore, and the company could claim salvage rights if it turned out to have value. He sent the report before he could change his mind. That night, while most of the crew played cards in the mess hall, Derek stayed alone on deck. The ocean stretched around him in every direction, black and endless, the surface broken only by the faint reflection of the moon. He leaned on the railing, listening to the low hum of the engines and the faraway hiss of the waves. somewhere